Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I watched After Death twice.
Wow.
I enjoyed it very much, so I watched it again. So I wanted to talk to you today about the film. Um, it's coming out in theaters October 27th. Um, is this a Fathom event?
No, this is going to be a wide theatrical release.
Oh,
So we should be in a roughly we're aiming for 2,000 theaters across Canada and the US.
perfect.
Yeah,
Well, can you tell me a little bit about what talk to me about the film. What is it?
sure. So After Death is a feature-length documentary on near-death experiences. So we interview scientists and doctors as well as hear from firsthand accounts of people who clinically died, anywhere between seconds to an hour and 45 minutes in the film.
And tell me what sparked your interest in this topic.
Yeah, for me, it was born out of loss. So the reason why I even got like interested in near death experiences altogether, back in 2012, my brother-in-law was killed by a drunk driver, and he was 36 years old, and he was here one moment and gone the next. So, and for us, we had no goodbye. There was no closure. I can't hear his laugh. All that just disappeared in a moment. And then about less than a year and a half later, my father-in-law died as well. So my wife's family, they're an immigrant family from Croatia, very close. I was just as close with them. And the family of four goes down to family two. And I met my wife in church, so I grew up in the church, grew up as a Christian all my life. And suddenly I just, found myself asking really difficult questions. Like for me, I just what why did this happen, right? Why is this chaos happen? Why would God allow something like that? If there is a God, why would he allow for something like that to happen? And then, if there is a God, where, what is heaven? Where is heaven? And what does that look like? Part of me is just like, I had a faith in Christ, and I, believe that there's a heaven, and that there, after all this chaos, there's something that kind of, there's some justice, I guess, in the end, and things would work out in the end. But I'm not seeing it here, and so, um, yeah, I just really kind of wanted to explore for myself some of those really deep questions, and know one way or another, basically, is heaven real, or is that just something that I was raised to believe and just kind of accepted, right?
Right.
So yeah, this film is kind of a result of that whole process. Shortly after going through all that loss, we were given some books from friends on people who had a near death experience, who died for a period of time, saw heaven, and came back. And to be honest with you, the first couple of books, I think I didn't really know what to make of it. I didn't want to read it all the way through. My wife read it all the way through. My mother-in-law read it all the way through. They were hooked, and I could see the change in them. I could see the hope, like, kind of being restored. And then it was actually a little while later, I heard an audio interview of this guy, Dr. Richard Eby, and he was a doctor who he fell out of a building 2 stories,
Mm.
and he landed on a sidewalk. Basically, his head had crushed in, and so, um, but his description, and so later he came back, but his description of what he experienced in those moments, basically right after death, to the point that he came back into his body, were so detailed,
Mm.
and so, I don't know, they were just so descriptive, and felt I just it just felt like, wow, like, why would this guy be making all this kind of stuff up, right? It hooked me, I think, in a way that nothing else had. And so then that was my venture into this world. And then I, read something like 30 books and all that. And yeah, basically, I'm going into a long story here, but the short of it is, after going through all those different books, me as a filmmaker, hearing from these actual people meant more to me than, the Hollywood film, right? Like, even though our our movie's coming out in the theaters and we do have narrative reenactments, it was really important for me to hear from the people who actually had these experiences, and then the doctors who pronounced them dead, eyewitnesses to the scenes, and all that kind of stuff. So How do you eat an elephant just one bite at a time? I went out and told one story, 2017. I made a short doc called Discovering Heaven, which told the story of Captain Dale Black, who died in a plane crash. There was two other pilots, so it was three pilots altogether. Two never made it back. Dale eventually came back and he became the sole survivor. And sure enough, there's an NTSB investigation, there's eyewitnesses, there's a lot of documentation around the crash itself and, the life-threatening injuries. And Dale had this tremendous experience of, seeing the crash, seeing the operation take place to try and bring his body back online, and then going to heaven and
Mhm.
coming back. So yeah, so I told that story. It got a lot of attention. I think there's some authenticity in both the way I'm trying to tell these stories, but also, the stories themselves. I'm making it for me, but I'm also, vicariously kind of living through what did my brother-in-law experience, right? So my hope is that this film, which eventually turned into a feature-length film, that the audience kind of feels that.
Yes. Tell me what you learned about the after death experience as you're making this film.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, Dale was the first person I sat in an interview chair across from. And I think for me, it's a combination of the things that they're saying, but also, interviewing now, I don't know, 30, 40 different people, 14 different people that we've included in the film, and some people from all around the world, different countries, non-Western countries, and they're saying such similar things. The overlap is really interesting. And so for me, it was, I guess it was cathartic. It I'm able to kind of think about, again, what did my brother-in-law experience? And Dale's describing, for example, the first few moments after the crash. It's not like they realize they're dead immediately. Their first experience is that they're outside of their body, and so sometimes there's a little bit of confusion because typically their observation is from a height like well above their body or from a different perspective. There's one lady, Pam Reynolds, in our film, who her perspective was over the shoulder of the surgeon who's basically opening up her head during a surgery. Dale was in a plane crash, something like, I don't know, 15, 20 feet or something above his body. And he's seeing basically the wreckage, right? So he's seeing the result of the crash, and there's two pilots that are clearly, deceased. And then he's seeing himself. And so realizing that's me, and yet I'm up here and I'm not dead, right? So it's like this kind of momentary confusion. But all of their kind of experiences, like they say that experience is more real than here. Um it's they're more alive there than they are here. And then, Mary says it in a very articulate way, that she felt that she didn't just go from consciousness to being conscious to unconscious. It was like going from conscious to more conscious. So it's like it's almost like a different awareness or different conscious experience, which is, unlike sleep, right? Sleep is typically you have a dream, if you're lucky enough to remember it. Typically it's a little strange, and there's some things that, we're taking a lot of information throughout the day and our brain is processing and doing all these different things, but their experience seems to be quite different.
Yes. And this film is not a faith-based Christian perspective necessarily. Um, it's just not based necessarily as a Christian film. Can you tell me the process of that? Um, you told it more from a scientific perspective. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, so death is something that affects everybody, right? So um we went into it with that, that's how we wanted to approach the film, because death is something that affects literally every single human. And we at some point we're all going to go through grief, sometimes early in life like myself, or sometimes later in life. Eventually it hits us. If we have loved ones around us, death is inevitable, but it's inevitable for every single person as well. So the hope is that this film kind of causes a lot of like personal reflection. And you know I fully am aware that, including a lot of my friends and even my brother-in-law's friends, that they're not Christian. They don't come from from a faith background. But again, death is something that affects everyone. So the fact that these experiences are happening didn't really. It's not that people are only having a near-death experience because they were Christian, right? Like if they clinically died for a period of time, it really doesn't matter what kind of person they were, they're going to have an experience if they had a near death experience.
Mhm.
So that was the approach we took. And actually, to our amazement too, when we started to kind of unravel this thing in the feature length, was that there's just a lot of science and a lot of data points around these near death experiences. It
Right.
was Yeah, it's like it's so interesting that there's a lot of personal experiences out there, and of course there's a lot of books, a lot of stories that exist, and even some narrative kind of recreations of some of these stories. But there's a lot of science to go along with this too, which really kind of started in the late '60s.
What was the most meaningful story that you filmed, and why was that the most meaningful?
I think Don Piper's story for me might have been one of the most meaningful, but it's also one of the most challenging for me, and my wife as well. It's real largely because it's so too close to how I lost my brother-in-law in a vehicle accident. And Don was declared dead at the scene. He was checked, I think, 4 different times, and he didn't have a pulse. So, and it was the same with my brother-in-law. He was declared dead at the scene. So I think the things that he's describing and the things that he saw, but I think even almost more importantly is when he came back. I used to think going into this film that these people are, what I wouldn't give to have this experience, to even see a glimpse of my brother-in-law. Like, where is he now? What is he experiencing? And I feel like that I always felt like going into this film that would help me, live this life, with more faith and hope and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting. Dawn is an example, like many in the film, where having that kind of revelation or that vision, that experience of heaven is almost too much to take in, because that's the home where we belong. That's what we're made for. And once you go there, and sin doesn't exist, pain doesn't exist, loss doesn't, like, all of that stuff doesn't exist. There's no more pain, there's no more sorrow, all that stuff is removed. And yeah, so we have that here on earth. So Don comes back, he's actually prayed back. We don't have that part in the film, but it's an interesting kind of side to his story, is that he was prayed back at the accident scene, and then he showed some vitals, and they managed to get him out of the car, bring him to the hospital. It was quite an ordeal. And some 30 something surgeries that he had to go through just to kind of survive. And some of the things that they had to do to his legs were they hadn't done to a person yet in North America. It's very experimental, growing bones and all kinds of terrible things. I mean, Don today, he walks around in physical pain every day. So it's like, he's living with a combination of that. He was shown where we're going to go, where we belong, and then to come back here, kind of live through the pain, the physical pain, but then also just the kind of loss and depression of having to the reality of having to be back here and live this life.
Mm.
He just talks about, like, that's more real than here. And that's really where we belong. And he's he can't he's looking forward to going back. And so yeah, I think that was the most impactful for me, because it made me think, as much as I wish my brother-in-law was here, surely he's in a better place.
What is the takeaway when you have audiences come and see your film? What do you want them walking away thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I I hope that this film, I guess, that it causes people to reflect. I hope that it causes a lot of personal reflection. For those that don't really think that this is real, these people, what they're experiencing is real. I mean, you don't really have to take any of their word for it either. Like, I think a lot of the people in the film would say, They don't assume that you're going to believe them, right? But I would say just, consider the evidence. There's a lot of evidence in the film to consider, and you know, we're not setting out to necessarily prove one thing or another. Our hope is that the audience really kind of reflects and kind of like lets that linger and begins to ask that question, is there life after death? And I mean, if there is life after death, what could that mean for this life? What could we do with the time that we have here? And, how could we live with an
Right,
eternal perspective?
right.
That's my hope.
And who is your audience?
Honestly, it's very broad. That's not something you typically want to say with a film. You want to have an audience, a very specific audience in mind, but because death affects everyone, my hope is that, and I think that this film really does speak to a very broad audience. We made it for skeptics, but we also made it for believers. So if people, have a faith background, I think this film will help build up their faith. It'll give even more hope, and it'll cause them to, I think, read the Bible more. I think it'll encourage you to get closer to God, and to pray more and think about God more. But then for skeptics, just the same, we don't assume anything for the people coming into it, that you have a faith background. You don't need to have a faith background to watch this film. And so, yeah, it's very broad. I would just say the caveat being maybe not for small children, because it's a heavy topic.
Yes. And how can people watch this film?
So it releases in theaters October 27th. It'll be a wide release across Canada and the United States. It should be in every major city. And you can go to angel.com/afterdeath to get tickets, find out where it's playing.
Is there anything I haven't asked you about the film that you think our readers need to know?
I don't know if it's worth highlighting some of the people or the books in the film, if the books are, memorable for some people. So Dr. Jeffrey Long is in our film. He's a radiation oncologist. He started the Near Death Experience Research Foundation in 1998, which is the world's largest collection of near death reports. It's in multiple languages, and it's something that's studied all around the world, scientifically. And he has a New York Times bestselling book, Evidence for the Afterlife. We have John Burke in our film, who wrote the book Imagine Heaven. Dr. Raymond Moody, who wrote the book Life After Life. And one of the more interesting and newer stories that we include in the film is Dr. Zamar. He's a physician, neuroscientist, neurosurgeon, and he actually he did a study published in 2022, and we're the first film to include his story. That it's an EEG recording of the first dying human brain. And so, yeah, we take a look at that, and what does that mean, and what's the process of dying?
Right. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for talking to me today. I really
Yeah,
appreciate
of
it.
course. Yeah, thanks for your time, Nancy.
Yes, thank you.